Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Russia Public Policy Speaker Series. I'm Alex Cooley. I'm the current director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. And on behalf of my colleague, Joshua Tucker of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, we want to welcome you. And today we also have another sponsoring partner, NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. And so we're really grateful and excited to be working with Ziv Sanderson and his institute on this. Now, the topic for today's seminar is one that's been in and out of the news a lot, more in lately. And we're just, absolutely thrilled to be able to sort of bring together some of the leading analytical minds and authors on the topic of Russian electoral interference. And so we're going to be discussing the present, the past, and the future. Just a reminder that this is the final RPP of the season, and we will take about a month break and we'll rejoin again in September. We'll try and do about one of these per month, bringing again lively cross-professional expertise on leading academic topics of the day involving Russia. So it's wonderful to have you here. And again, thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for sponsoring this series. You do have the program in front of you, hopefully on the website. I'm just going to sort of turn things over to Josh Tucker, who will introduce the session and also his colleague. So take it away, Josh.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. This is a special pleasure for me and also a wonderful way to be wrapping up the New York City Russia Public Policy Series for the academic year 2019-2020, because I'm able to bring together my two major academic interests. As Alex mentioned, I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, but I'm also one of the co-directors for the Center for Social Media and Politics. And the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics examines the interaction of social media and politics. It also looks at ways to use social media data to study politics in new and innovative ways. And we also produce open source tools to try to make it easier for other people to be able to do the same. You can check us out on our website. We're at csmapnyu.org. And it's a great pleasure to sort of have both of these institutions co-sponsoring this event. But none of this would be happening, or this particular event would not be happening, were it not for the initiative of Ziv Sanderson, who's the executive director of CSMAP, who came to us with this idea of putting together this seminar series. CSMAP is going to be starting its own seminar series kind of like this in the fall. You'll hear more from us about that if you're interested. And Ziv put together the idea for this, so I'm going to turn it over to Ziv to introduce our speakers. And as Alex said, we're going to introduce, just because we've discovered this is definitely the best way to go with webinar type events, we're going to introduce each speaker in turn. They'll speak and then we'll introduce the next speaker. So Ziv?
All right, thanks, Alex and Josh. We're thrilled to be co-sponsoring today's seminar with the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center, and to have such an incredible group of scholars with us today. Our first speaker today will be David Scheimer, who is the author of the fantastic new book, Rigged: America, Russia, and 100 Years of Covert Electoral Interference, which was published last month by Knopf. He is pursuing a doctorate in international relations at the University of Oxford as a Marshall Scholar. His reporting and analysis have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. He's an associate fellow of Yale University, where he received his undergraduate and master's degrees in history, and a global fellow at the Wilson Center. David, it's great to see you today.
Thank you very much for having me and for organizing this panel. I mean, yeah, really, thank you especially to Ziv for putting this together. It's really exciting to be here and to be able to talk about my research with such renowned scholars. I would say that what I'd like to focus on in my presentation is the past part of the past, present, and future of the threat of Russian interference, to show or to argue that Russian interference in the 2016 election was just the latest episode in a very old story, and to make the case that by understanding it as such and seeing it as only the latest example of a foreign country interfering in the elections of another country, we can understand Russia's operation in entirely new ways, and we can anticipate what might happen in the future from a much more informed perspective. So what I'd like to map out here is sort of the century-long history of covert electoral interference in about 15 minutes, which I've timed out and is in fact possible. And before I do that, I would just like to make clear and define what I mean by covert electoral interference. And what I mean by that is operations executed by intelligence services that qualify as covert, which means your hand is hidden, electoral, which means that you're targeting an electoral process, and interference, which means that you're not just watching, you're acting, you're interfering and manipulating. So therefore, what I mean by covert electoral interference is a concealed foreign effort to manipulate a democratic vote of succession. And as it turns out, that is a phenomenon that has run across the last 100 years of US-Russian relations, and that has been a part of more or less every key historical juncture in that century-long trajectory. And before I map out how that is the case, I'll also say there are two ideas that are very important to keep in mind in understanding that history. The first is that every covert electoral interference operation involves either efforts to alter actual ballots, to manipulate votes, or efforts to manipulate voters, and therefore by that I mean to manipulate public opinion. You're doing one of those two things if you're interfering covertly in a foreign election, whether it's 1919 or 2019. And the second point here is that this really is a story of Washington and Moscow. Both the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia have been pioneers in the practice of interfering covertly in foreign elections. And to understand that story and how we arrived at our current moment, it's very essential to look at both of those historical arcs. So moving to the actual history, there are three phases of covert electoral interference, three phases of this history as I describe it. The first phase took place between 1919 and 1947. And that phase was a story of Soviet interference in foreign elections. Vladimir Lenin, the first Soviet leader, founded an organization known as the Communist International, by which he brought together communist parties of the world, and with the express purpose of getting those communists into power and then abolishing their democracies from within. And he therefore tried to help them by interfering in elections on their behalf, by helping fund their campaigns, by spreading propaganda on their behalf, manipulating voters. However, those efforts were very limited and primitive, but the idea was there, and interestingly, so was the paranoia. Because as Lenin and then Joseph Stalin, his successor, were using the Communist International to target elections globally, paranoia festered in countries like America and the United Kingdom, where they were bracing for and fearful of the prospect of foreign interference in their elections. So that was present from the start, but the actual sweep and scale of these operations was somewhat lacking. That changed in 1945, which is the end-ish of this first phase, when Joseph Stalin's forces marched across Eastern Europe, and you saw extraordinary operations to interfere in elections in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and other countries with, as I mentioned, both efforts to alter ballots. So you saw stuffing of ballot boxes, purging of voter rolls, manipulating voter databases, but also really extensive efforts to manipulate people, millions of pieces of propaganda, leaflets, posters, pamphlets spread across these electorates in order to convince voters to support one side over another. That phase then ends. That's the first phase of this history. When the second phase starts, because Harry Truman, who was the president of the United States at the time, decides to respond in kind. At the end of 1947, he authorizes the CIA for the first time to engage formally in covert action with the express purpose of interfering in an election, which was in Italy. So the starting point, somewhat ironically, of CIA covert action was electoral interference. In 1948, which is now the second phase, we're in the second phase, which is 48 to 1991. In 1948, the CIA launches a massive operation to interfere in the Italian election through spreading disinformation and black propaganda, manipulating voters extensively, seeking to orchestrate popular initiatives in favor of the centrist Christian Democrats against the communists, who the KGB, by the way, were supporting. And by orchestrating initiatives that seem spontaneous, but in fact were concocted and enhanced by American intelligence. After the 48 election, the Christian Democrats, the centrist candidates in Italy, won, and the CIA believed that they made all the difference. And another pattern in this history is that in operations to influence voters, you never actually know if you made the difference, but the perception often matters more than the reality. And the perception of the CIA was that they saved Italy. We got the Christian Democrats into office. And so the CIA then decided we're going to apply this weapon to elections all over the world. So the CIA and the KGB, from Chile to Japan to El Salvador and France, were interfering in elections on a global basis, either seeking to manipulate voters and in rare instances to manipulate ballots. And by the way, as part of that history, the KGB was interfering in US elections. In very primitive ways. Again, this wasn't the kind of systemic infestation that we saw in 16, but the ideas were all there. You saw the KGB seek to sow discord, especially along racial and religious lines. You saw them seeking to help some candidates at the expense of others. You saw them offer to collude directly with certain politicians, such as Hubert Humphrey and Adlai Stevenson, who are leading Democratic politicians of their era. And you saw them seek to find and release damaging private materials about politicians they didn't like, and you saw them spread disinformation and propaganda in America's information ecosystem at the time. So that's phase two. The end of that phase comes with the end of the Cold War, at which point the overriding objectives of CIA and KGB operations disappear, which were to either contain or spread communism and ideology. And so in that third phase, you then see a divergence in behavior. So this is 1991 to the present, where the CIA has moved away from, but not abandoned, the practice of covert electoral interference. And as I discovered in my research, for example, the CIA was authorized to interfere in the Serbian election in 2000 with very similar ideas, millions of dollars, helping a campaign function, spreading propaganda, et cetera, to defeat a candidate that America did not like, Slobodan Milosevic. But by and large, that's become the exception rather than the rule for American foreign policy. Whereas for Russia, it's been the opposite story. Vladimir Putin's regime has rediscovered and enhanced the weapon of covert electoral interference and applied it once again to elections all over the world in this new digital world that opens up new opportunities to build upon ideas that have existed for a very long time. And his objectives have also evolved. Whereas Vladimir Lenin, Stalin, and their successors sought to only support leftist candidates with rare exceptions, Putin doesn't care about ideology. He believes he's locked in a power struggle, not an ideological struggle with the West. And he believes that it's in his interest to support authoritarian-minded, divisive candidates, whether it's on the far right or the far left, in order to divide democracies both internally and from one another, especially to degrade the legitimacy and reputation of the democratic process of succession, to pull countries into his own orbit and to show his own people elections don't actually work. It's all a farce. It just like it doesn't work here. It also doesn't even work in America. It's all a lie. So you've seen Russia interfere in elections from Ukraine to Montenegro to France and the United Kingdom. Again, either targeting election infrastructure, as in Ukraine, where Russia sabotaged Ukraine's election systems, and that's the lane of altering ballots, or just spreading massive amounts of propaganda, either across social media or by stealing and releasing private materials of public figures. And many of these ideas in the digital domain have been tested in Ukraine and then applied more broadly. And 2016 is a part of that story. So Russia, this is not an American phenomenon. It's not as though America is unique in Russia seeking to interfere in our elections. It just perhaps felt that way because the KGB so struggled to really meaningfully manipulate US elections, whereas Putin did not. So I would say that in seeking to understand what happened in 2016, there were 4 similarities between the past and the present. The first is that Putin sought to sow discord and help a candidate, Donald Trump. That is something that the KGB did, again, in many US elections. That was just the latest episode in that arc. The second similarity was that Vladimir Putin's intelligence hackers targeted our voting systems, penetrated our election infrastructure. As we've seen from Stalin in Eastern Europe to Ukraine in 2014, that is a Russian tradition as well, seeking to get inside voting systems. What Russia did with the hacking and releasing of private materials about John Podesta and the Democratic National Committee, a very old Soviet idea, finding and releasing damaging information about public figures in order to destroy them. That is something that the KGB did to try to destroy a US presidential candidate, for example, in '76. It remains part of the Russian tradition today. And then the fourth similarity was what Russia did across social media, which was new in that it was applied to a new platform, but the idea to spread disinformation, to scare voters, to sow racial discord, to target voters based on who they are and what they believe, to turn out some voters and suppress others, again, very old ideas that have been applied to elections all over the world. But again, now it's to America. And so what were Putin's actual achievements then in 2016? I would say there were two. The first is that he fused two types of electoral interference in a very clever way, which is that he was both manipulating voters with emails and across social media, but he was also probing, penetrating, and scanning our election systems. And what I found in my research is that Russia's ability and access to our voting systems, the notion that they might escalate toward altering the actual ballots of US citizens, froze the Obama administration in the summer and fall of 16, because there was a notion that it's not great that Russia's manipulating public opinion, but imagine if Russia sought to sabotage our actual voting process. And so that put the government, our government, in a very difficult position. And his second achievement was that he penetrated a US election at scale, because the KGB had never been able to do that. We'd done that in countries like Italy and Chile, but before there was this digital environment, America was much more secure from such infestation, and that's no longer the case. And it allowed Putin to turbocharge all of these ideas that I've been talking about in seeking to both influence voters and potentially to alter actual election systems, which, based on all available evidence, he could have done but did not do 4 years ago. So that's where we are. That's the end of phase 3. Perhaps now we're entering into a new phase or continuing in that third phase. I'm not sure yet, because this history is still evolving. But there are a couple of lessons that I think are very important to keep in mind based on that history. The first is that this was an evolution of 2016 was the evolution of a practice, not a creation of one. And when people say, how do we respond to this threat? Our only point of comparison should not be 2016. It's like only trying to learn from one case of a phenomenon. It doesn't really make any sense. There are so many instances of this around the world and in the past in our own elections that show what the patterns here are, what we can anticipate next, because there are patterns here if we look for them. The second thing is that this isn't a political threat. Folks like to say if you're a Democrat, then you buy into this, or if you're a Republican, you don't. And what history instructs is that that's not true, because the KGB sought to destroy the candidacies, for example, of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, Republicans. Now Vladimir Putin thinks it's in his interest to help a Republican in America, but it's not about any political party. It's about tearing down and corrupting American democracy, which is a threat to the nation and not any one political party. And any illusion of that notion should be, kind of abolished by just restoring history to this subject. I also would say that anyone who says that our elections could just be secured completely are wrong. Elections are by nature penetrable. This has been happening for 100 years. Leaders seeking to interfere covertly in foreign elections. The whole idea of an election is that it is manipulatable because it's open, it's transparent, it's accessible, it involves campaigning and the shaping of public opinion. So we could manage this threat. And I could talk more about how I believe we could in the Q&A, but anyone who says, again, that this is a solvable problem completely, I don't think that's realistic, and I wouldn't take that argument very seriously. I would say that the best way to anticipate what Russia will do next is by looking abroad, by learning from other democracies rather than only looking at ourselves, because we're just a part of this policy of Putin's. And if we look abroad, we'll learn a lot about what might actually be impending. And then finally, I would say that, I guess I would say two things. One is that polarization here really does matter. The more polarized our country, the more vulnerable we are to subversion, because it's easier to manipulate people when they're tense, when they hate one another, when they're confronting one another, when everyone's already so on edge. And when we talk about how to make ourselves more immune to this sort of subversion, a lot of it just has to do with repairing our own democracy. And those two things go hand in hand. And Russia recognizes that as much as we do, or as much as we should. I also would say that any effort to address this problem needs to involve both efforts to defend against operations to alter ballots and efforts to manipulate voters. Any politician who says that by securing our election infrastructure, we're therefore solving this problem is not being straightforward or, in my opinion, honest. Let's say we secure our election infrastructure. That does nothing to resolve the email and social media components that we saw in 16, which was Russia's operation in reality as to what they actually did. So you have to do both things, and you have to care about both things. And the last thing I'll say is that history does provide reassurance here. there's a lot of, I think, people throwing their hands up and saying democracy's doomed, we're all screwed. And that's not true either, because so many democracies have been attacked in the last 100 years. Their elections put under siege, in some cases by our intelligence services, and decades later, they remain vibrant democracies. This isn't an existential threat, but it is a serious one. And much of responding to it just comes down to citizens caring, to countries to the electorate being engaged, to being offended by others seeking to manipulate your democracy. And if you can respond to that as a nation, there's no reason historically to believe that this will lead to the end of American democracy, so long as American citizens care enough to push back against that threat. And I will stop there.
All right, thanks so much, David. That was, in fact, 100 years of history in 16 minutes. So I don't know what that means. But thanks. I'm looking forward to digging into a lot of that in the Q&A. So our next speaker is RENEE DIRESTA. RENEE is the technical research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, where she investigates the spread of malign narratives across social and other media networks. RENEE's area of research include disinformation and propaganda by state-sponsored actors and health misinformation and conspiracy theories. RENEE has advised Congress, the State Department, and other academic, civic, and business organizations. And at the request of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, she led one of the 2 research teams that produced comprehensive assessments of the IRA's and GRU's influence operations targeting the US from 2014 to 2018. RENEE, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I'm going to share some slides because I grabbed some of the deck that I had made for some of the early Senate briefings on this as we were doing the investigation. And what I'd like to do is walk through visually a little bit the kind of near history. So 2016 through 2020 in 15 minutes. And let me share this screen here. Because I feel that, whoops, did I share? Can you guys see just my PowerPoint or my entire desktop there? All right, hang on a second, so there we go.
Yeah, it's just the PowerPoint.
All right, you can just do PowerPoint, got the
Yep.
up there, okay, great. So,
all good.
Some of the work that we've done, both prior to me joining SIO about a year ago and then since, has looked at a variety of Russian operations, particularly in the context of understanding the ways in which different capability sets are brought together for one core purpose. Even if we don't have the kind of smoking gun linking the operations, what we look at is ways in which the operations either temporally or thematically overlap to try to get an understanding of what this operation meant in a broader context. So the work that I've done is focused on 3 different actors. First is the Internet Research Agency, which is operated by independent contractors, Yevgeny Prigozhin, but it is not a direct, it does not report directly to the Kremlin. It is not a branch of the Russian government, military, or intelligence apparatus. The GRU or GU it's Russian military intelligence. And then the Wagner Group and what we call associated entities we'll go into because those nominally don't really exist. And so the paramilitary organizations, the ways in which franchised operations and other kind of private actors that have begun to pick up some of this work beyond the Internet Research Agency are an interesting development that we've observed over the last few years. So starting with the Internet Research Agency, what I would encourage people to understand about this particular entity, everybody's seen the memes. And so this is a social influence operation. So what was happening here was memetic propaganda. So propaganda designed to fit the dominant social ecosystem of the day, which is Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Pokemon Go, all the places where regular people congregate and spend time together and transmit information in a very person-to-person kind of way. So there are certain design structures that these platforms privilege. And by producing propaganda to fit the technological system of the day, this is how propaganda works, it always evolves to fit the technological system of the day. What you start to see is ways in which they're producing content designed for person-to-person sharing, person-to-person transmission. So this was a meme by one of their Instagram pages, Angry Eagle, that actually I believe was repurposed from Turning Point USA. So part of the meme culture of the internet is this idea of constantly repurposing, taking something, remixing it a little bit, putting it out to your audience, targeting your audience so that you're finding the people who are most likely to be receptive to your message, who will then continue and share it on. So one of the things that we observed with the Internet Research Agency dataset was a commitment to kind of constantly testing and iterating and understanding what their audience was receptive to. So the three memes up here are all from the Army of Jesus Instagram, Instagram account. So if you recall Army of Jesus, you've probably seen the Hillary and Satan fighting meme. It's kind of one of the more prominent ones. Army of Jesus actually started out as a Kermit the Frog meme page. And so January 2015, we already knew that Russia was operating by June or July of 2015. Adrian Chen's article, The Agency, had come out. They had begun with these sort of like loosely cultural, pseudo-artistic, random snippets of American culture that they kind of went for first. You can see the collection of hashtags, follow back, and to follow. Most of it is really just audience building at this point. For some reason, Kermit the Frog, the Muppets was where they went first. What you start to see, though, is that the Muppets really don't do it for American audiences, as it turns out. And so you see them switch to The Simpsons. And so this is the post upon which they switched the page over from being a Kermit page to a Simpsons page. And then shortly after, about 6 months later again, you see it become a Jesus page. And that is when it takes off. And it turns out that like for Jesus, love for Jesus drives phenomenal amounts of engagement among the audiences they're targeting. They actually do begin to amass a follower count at that point. They actually do begin to amass an audience and with some influence. And then they realize that, kind of hitting these kind of cultural niche issues, the big culture war themes is, far more productive than going for these kind of random American cultural kind of commodities like television shows. So there is this way in which you do see that process evolve. So you see they're incorporating in information as they go about what kind of content their audience is receptive to. So this is very much like a marketing operation. And then what they do is they begin to really kind of hit their stride as they, again, find their populations, segment their audiences, constantly put out calls to like and share, which is kind of constantly using the platform's ability to push propaganda into other people's feeds by way of this person-to-person participatory transmission. And you start to see them really hitting their stride as far as engagements go. So 700,000 on the veteran, 900, close to 1 million on Yosemite Sam there. And so you see them find what works, find a system, and then they just start to pump it out. This just becomes the norm. So once they find memes that work, they do repurpose them across pages. So it's, again, kind of double down on your winners, same way that you would with a marketing operation. And so you can see the same memes being branded as being patriotic up on the top there, stop all invaders down on the bottom. They do this with the left as well. So I've shown a bunch of the kind of right-leaning memes, but again, they're doing this for all of they segment roughly into left America, right America, and then Black America gets its own special treatment, which we'll go into in a second. So now you have this collection of about 167, I think, different accounts split between Facebook and Instagram. And what they begin to do is interlink their accounts. So if you're following one, you're going to see content from another. And so we called this the media mirage. Basically, once you're in this ecosystem, once you're following these accounts, there's this constant cross promotion of more accounts to kind of push you deeper into that operational ecosystem. So I apologize for the eye chart. I think you can, it's actually decently high resolution on my screen right now. But what you'll see is in this particular diagram, we were looking solely at the accounts targeting the Black community. So you see their Facebook pages are squares, their Instagram accounts are parallelograms, and the cloud things are what we believe were real, authentic Black media. So you see them, this is mentions. This is a graph of mentions of how they were engaging and interacting with other entities in the ecosystem. So what they do is they create their media properties and then they network them with not only their other media properties. So you're seeing not only their other Black propaganda, but you also see them working within the real Black media community to try to get mentions, to try to gain legitimacy. Because if you're getting recommended by the real community, you are at that point kind of reaching new audiences, but you've also legitimized yourself as kind of part of the media ecosystem. So again, rather extensive network of pages that they were working with, including like cross-promoting coupon codes and things like that for Black-owned businesses. But then we get to the point where it stops being a marketing and propaganda operation and begins to become the modern day variant of agents of influence. So as David mentioned, there's this kind of KGB commitment to a variety of wide swath of sources, a wide swath of operational tactics, and one of which includes using real people to infiltrate protest movements, using real people to target high value potential assets who can become unwitting tools of electoral interference. And so that's what we see here as well, the kind of targeting and recruitment of the unwitting. So one of the ways that we see the modernization of agents of influence online is you have just Facebook personas where the operators of the pages are constantly putting out calls, particularly again in the Black community, asking for people to serve as the face of their purported Black media properties. So they're come be a calendar girl, come videotape a protest. Are you a lawyer? Can you serve it at can you call in or dial into a immigration hearing information session? We saw them putting out calls to teach karate classes for self-defense and protests. So they begin to find people who become, they connect with on a one-on-one level. And so this is where you really see that very big distinction between just being a meme shop and being an active, working to actively infiltrate movements by way of social media connection. Once they have that infiltration, this is where you start to see them driving in the streets unrest. And so it doesn't just stop in the online environment, it becomes physical real world protests, the most notorious of which was one in Houston, Texas, where they had their pro-Islamic page and a pro-Texas secessionist page come to have a protest at the same place at the same time. And there's YouTube footage of it up taken by eyewitnesses who were there, where you have two different opposing parties, one from each page on opposite sides of the street, yelling at each other, and the police are there in the middle. So again, just using development of relationships, development of assets, taking it again from it goes one step beyond the memes. The memes is where a lot of people pay attention, think this was a social influence meme operation. It was actually used to do much more than that. So in the interest of time, then we get to what the GRU is doing, or the GU. So the GU is operational at the same time. And the US election is the kind of big vertical bar there in the middle, November 2016. But what you see is the GU begins operating actually prior to the Internet Research Agency. So before the IRA was hyperactive on social media, on Facebook in particular, particularly targeting the US, the GU is already there. And what they're doing, if you look at the page names on the left, is they're really running influence operations tied to geopolitical areas of interest. So not social issues, not culture war, not random American television shows. They're just going very much immediately for things like the Russian Kuril Islands, where they're having a territorial dispute with Japan. And so they're using social media to try to influence public perception of geopolitical events. So they do start by trying to do the same kind of meme culture thing. So this is one of the GRU memes, mocking the idea that the US would have something to say about the annexation of Crimea, given Iraq, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. What ultimately happens, though, is that their social operation is an absolute flop. So none of these pages, if you look at the fourth column in here, average number of likes, that's the entirety of the page. So across 1,500 posts, your average number of likes per post is 0.6. So these are flop pages. This is nothing compared to the hundreds of millions of engagements that we see. The 900,000 on Yosemite Sam. Right. So this is a failure. So what we see from the GRU, though, is they begin to what they continue to do is they run a narrative propaganda strategy. So they actually largely abandon the memetics. They're not trying to make pithy memes and get people sharing. What you start to see them doing, rather than going for this person-to-person social share, is they begin to write long-form content and they begin to target the media. So different target. So one of the ways that they do this is they set up front organizations. So this is a page for Inside Syria Media Center, which purportedly was a collection of journalists writing about Syria with an on-the-ground perspective. This is one of many. They did this for a number of different geographical regions that they had interest in. But so they set up the front site, they set up front think tanks, front media properties. This again, not new, this is a very old KGB tactic, just brought into the modern era by virtue of having the ability to legitimize a media property simply by having a website at this point. And what we start to see is the creation of fake personas. I think if I click one more time, yeah, there we go, there's a zoom there. The green dots are personas. The pink dots are where they place their articles. And so what you start to see is these fake journalists who don't exist. The persona, however, is created. They're attributed to, they work for one of the front organizations. So using Mehmet Ersoy down there on the bottom left, Mehmet was a journalist at Inside Syria Media Center, which was a GRU front. He would write articles for all of these other publications, including things like, I can't click on him in this diagram, but let's say Op-Ed News, for example, or Veterans Today. So you see them reaching into the niche media ecosystem, the sort of lefty aligned, maybe global leftist kind of movement ecosystem, the conspiratorial ecosystem, and he's placing bylined articles into that media ecosystem, which in turn has its own audience base that in turn goes and shares. And so you see this process, we called it narrative laundering, by which you take something, a message that the Russian government wants said, your fake think tank attributed persona, write something using his fake but seemingly legitimate affiliation, puts it into the media ecosystem, and then the fans of, say, the Duran go on to share it on social channels and directly. And so this is the process by which, again, it's distinctly different from what the IRA is doing. They're manipulating media, they're going through long form content, and they're pushing out broader ideas as opposed to just these snippets. The other thing that we see the GU do, of course, is it controls the narrative by way of the hack and leak operations. So the Podesta emails that David mentioned, but they've done this repeatedly in a number of different places. And so what we start to see is that, sorry, I'm getting like a chat notification here. What we start to see is that way in which the spear phishing and the hack and leak drives that part of the conversation as well. It really shifts the media narrative. And so while many people focus on the hundreds of millions of engagements that the IRA got, really the GRU's ability to control the American media narrative through Guccifer and those hacks actually does a lot more to shift conversation in our election to decide what we're talking about writ large versus the smaller niche targeted strategy of the IRA segmenting American society. So this is like a sneak preview slide. I'm doing a Black Hat keynote next week. But this is trying to think about how we model out, how do we model this conceptually? Because this is a thing that we see from a lot of sophisticated state actors. We're seeing any state actor that has control of a broadcast property, broadcast ecosystem, has control of a hack team, has control of social media pages, uses these things very much as a system. And so it's really thinking about not just one actor or one operation or one small thing, but viewing it as a kind of full spectrum operation that modernizes a lot of these same old tactics and old channels and uses them to facilitate, similar operations, but updated for the modern era. So just to very briefly go through a WAGNER group in the interest of answering the question of what comes next, which I think is part of where I've been asked to go here. When we were looking at, one of our scholars at Stanford has a project where she's been looking at Libya and the Libyan election. And one of the things that we found in the course of looking at how people were talking about and using social media in that election was this collection of pages that was loosely attributed to the WAGNER group. And Prigozhin affiliated entities as a way of saying, we don't know that it was WAGNER group specifically, but there were some leaked documents that suggested that there was a connection there. You can read the full report on Stanford to understand the attribution process. But here we see something very different, difficult. We see something where the entities that have previously run military operations, paramilitary operations, are running influence operations in theater as well, working to sway people's opinions about leaders in Libya, We see them playing actually multiple sides. Libya has a very contested, the election's not happening, there's a civil war. So working to kind of play multiple sides. And what we start to see though is the deployment of all of these different types of content and operational pathways simultaneously. So we see the social media pages. We see, again, there's the memetics. The one on the left is actually talking about some Russians who were arrested in Libya for election interference, and how that was all just no big deal, didn't happen. But you start to see, again, the memes kind of pushing out content for people to share directly. You see the creation of front think tanks and front newspapers. You see the expansion into the latest and most relevant social ecosystem of the day. So this Cartoon Star was one of the fake newspapers with a WhatsApp group. So you would join the lobby and then you would be brought into the kind of bigger WhatsApp group. So again, that expansion into new channels that are most relevant to the population. And then ultimately, Facebook took down, there was a collection related to Libya. There was also a collection related to Sudan and a few other countries in Africa. There were about 8 different countries. And what you saw was that Facebook, in its own investigation, made the attribution not only to fake personas, but to real people who were actively part of the operation. And it's unclear to what extent they knew who was funding it or who they were working for or what this newspaper that they'd been hired to create was or who was behind it. And that's part of, again, that same old time KGB strategy of varying degrees of wittingness among the people who are running the operation for you. But it makes it very interesting in the social media era as we start to think about how do we decide whether to take these accounts down? Because at this point, there's a legitimate person, a real person, not just a fake, troll persona in St. Petersburg, who's running that page. And so the question becomes, do we think about authenticity solely in terms of, is this a real person running this operation? Or how deep are the platforms asked to go to understand what is really behind this micromedia property that's effectively just hosted as a page on their site? So I think where does this leave us question, everybody wants to know what happens with 2020. I want to say one thing we still don't fully understand is impact. And this is a slide that I put up. It was a page by a real Black activist on Facebook. And when I was doing some of the investigation into the memes, this guy kept flagging because like 30–40% of the memes that he was sharing during that time were Internet Research Agency memes. But he was a real person, a real community activist, a real member of the community who just found them highly resonant. So he wasn't actively part of anything. In fact, you saw as his posts went on, somebody, I guess, flagged this for him and he realized, hey, they kind of stole my brand and here I am using their content, and there was kind of a wake up moment. But ultimately the question becomes, if it doesn't change someone's mind, what impact is it having? And so this is where we get a lot of questions around, we can gauge engagement. So here's a graph, this is from one of my Senate decks. So Stop All Invaders up there, you see 12.5 million engagements. So for the niche micro-targeted kind of groups and communities that they were going after, they were actually fairly successful. There's a long tail. There's of course a pretty significant drop off. A lot of the pages flopped, but for some of the ones that hit, they were among the sort of top 10 pages targeting these communities. At the same time though, we don't really know to what extent that changed hearts and minds. So when we think about influence operations, we're always trying to decide to what extent can we extrapolate out to impact when the instrumentation of the social ecosystem is really focused on just engagement. Did you like it? Did you share it? How can we maybe weight that in trying to understand whether it had an impact on someone else or any kind of downstream effects? So I will turn it over now to co-presenters and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Renee. One of my favorite anecdotes from David's book was that the CIA coordinated a massive mailing campaign in which an estimated 10 million letters were sent by Italian Americans to friends and family in Italy in support of the moderate Christian Democratic Party. And the reason I was so excited to bring together this particular group is that in Renee's work, we really get to see sort of in real time the adaptation of these strategies and techniques to the digital environment. And so for our final speaker today, to sort of wrap things up, we're going to have Kathleen Hall-Jamieson. Kathleen is the Elizabeth Ware Packard Professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication and the Director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center. She has authored or co-authored 16 books, including Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President, which is one of my favorite books on this topic, which won the Association of American Publishers 2019 R. Hawkins Award. In 2020, the National Academy of Sciences awarded Kathleen its Public Welfare Medal for her nonpartisan crusade to ensure the integrity of facts in public discourse and development of the science of scientific communication to promote public understanding of complex issues. She is also the co-founder of factcheck.org and its subsidiary site, SciCheck. Kathleen is a huge fan of your work. It's my immense pleasure to turn things over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me start by saying Cyber War is now in a revised second edition with 4 new chapters, and virtually everything has been updated. And now as the additional research is coming to mind, this seems to be one of those books that I wish you could stay online and update every single day, because there's new insight coming routinely, including from the 2 co-panelists whose work I greatly admire. I asked to be last so that I kind of fit in between the cracks, because I'm not a Russian expert. I studied the 2016 election in part to answer the question that Renee is phrasing. So what's likely to change hearts and minds? If this was just making more stuff out there that was stuff that was already there, but making it more visible, through social media to people who are already convinced in one direction or another, that probably isn't going to affect the electoral outcome. So what would you say the impact of all of this was, other than an expenditure of a whole lot of resources by Russians? And the answer is that what communication scholars know is that message imbalances can matter. And also that the topic that you think about and you prioritize changes the standards that you use to assess candidates. So if you're more likely to be thinking, for example, about immigration as opposed to healthcare, and you're an undecided voter, the likelihood, if you do not like certain immigration policies, but you like certain healthcare policies, if I can feature immigration policies about Hillary Clinton, I will reduce the likelihood that you, the undecided voter, are going to cast the vote for Hillary Clinton. So the question then becomes, did we have a susceptible audience in 2016? Because in most elections, we don't. In most elections, and it's the reason the political science community is so confident that what it calls structural variables usually determine outcomes of elections, and they're largely right about that, is because people are so anchored in their party identification and in their perceptions of incumbents and economy that there's not much that's going to shift them. Usually they're pretty locked in by the conventions. And as a result, when all this stuff starts to feed through the social media system, when it starts to move into the media agenda through the hacked content, they're just not susceptible to persuasion. They've already made up their minds. Confronted with new information, they're more likely to counter-argue. And as a result, you'd say, well, it's not going to create a difference. 2016 had unique susceptibilities. And as a result, one thing we know about communication is communication can create short-term effects and can matter on the margin. Communication doesn't usually create long-term effects, and they're not going to be large enough in any event under most circumstances to make a difference. But 2016 was going to be close, and you had a highly susceptible electorate in ways we didn't have in previous elections. So in 2016, and I'm particularly interested in the effects of the hacked content, if you created message imbalances and increased the prioritization of topics that disadvantaged Hillary Clinton, you had in the electorate a large enough number of people who had these characteristics and hence were susceptible. They weren't as anchored by party as the electorate had traditionally been. They were more likely to say they were independent than they had in the past. And as a result, the party anchorage wasn't as strong. They also were not happy with either of their choices. This is an election in which most people are holding their noses about both candidates, and that includes a whole lot of people who had already decided which candidate they were going to vote for. And as a result, what we saw was in the final month and a half of the election, we had an unprecedentedly high number of individuals still susceptible to persuasion. The traditional things that locked them in hadn't locked them in. And in that environment, now the question becomes, if message imbalances matter, and alternatively, if the agenda that you have primed, the topics that are more salient, can be primed against one candidate or toward another candidate, can you shift enough of those to account for a shift of 78,000 votes across 3 states? And when you look at the troll content, the social media content, the answer would not necessarily have to be phrased as, were they in those 3 states making a difference? Because they could have made their difference by dropping the difference between Trump and Clinton by enough before the last days of the election that small difference in those states made the difference. But the effect was that they had dropped the percent of favorability of Hillary Clinton before that and support level before that sufficiently that they don't have to be in those states. They're affected by across the nation. The troll content, as we reasonably can surmise from the available data, and the platforms have not been as disclosive, with the possible exception of Twitter, as they ought to be, would suggest that there wasn't enough content that was distributed to targeted audiences about electoral content to have created enough of an effect to have on its own dropped that percentage difference enough to have made a difference in the electoral outcome. It doesn't mean there might have been some shifting, but the likelihood is we can say about the Russian trolls, they're interesting for the moment. Let's just set them aside. Now let's look at the Russian hackers. Here's where the communication community actually has about 40 years of really strong research. We know that if you can change the media agenda, we can increase the likelihood that you, the audience, will prioritize the topics that are prioritized in the media agenda. The hacking demonstrably changed the media agenda. We see it on October 7th. If there had not been the release of the hacked Podesta content, the first release of the hacked Podesta content on October 7th, the agenda would have only had Access Hollywood in it, and it would have been more likely to have had prominently in it the disclosure by the federal agencies that the Russians were behind the hacking. What happened by virtue of the Podesta content being dropped on the 7th was the Access Hollywood tape was now driven into an equivalence frame in media against the Podesta hacked content. In the process, the press lost track of the news that ordinarily would have been the news of the day. That is, the federal government agencies had confirmed that the Russians were behind the hacking. Instead of the press tying the hacked content back to the Russians, it had 3 things on its menu. It dropped them to 2. We had Access Hollywood versus the hacked content, and the Russians simply disappeared as a source. If there was an effect produced by the hacked content in the United States, it was not by the GRU. It was by Julian Assange's strategic manipulation of the press in an environment in which the press understandably was overwhelmed by content that came to it in regular tranches across large periods of time and lost track of something it actually knew in summer, which is that Julian Assange was the one who was doing this, and Julian Assange didn't want Hillary Clinton elected. And something it also knew in summer, pretty strongly suspected in summer, it was the Russians behind this. And it knew that as of October 7th. So what is the credibility of the hacked content as it moves into media? If every news story with hacked content had started out by saying Russian hacked, illegally gotten content that is being trafficked to the US media through Julian Assange, who doesn't want Hillary Clinton elected, the credibility of that content would have been substantially diminished. And if the press had been highly aware that it was Russian content as it wrote the stories, that Julian Assange had strategic intent, it might have looked more carefully at the very carefully crafted strategic releases by Assange to be targeted to influence the election at the most important strategic times. And his adept manipulation of media, because by continuing to drop new content, he continued to spike the stories across time. And so across time, throughout October and the beginning of November, you have in the media agenda substantial amounts of agenda-setting hacked content that is not being discredited or at least analyzed critically by virtue of its Russian origins or Assange's manipulative intent. That's a huge failure on the part of the American press. And what happens as a result is you are creating topical agenda-setting effects, unscrutinized for their origin, and message imbalancing effects, unscrutinized for their origin. And as a result, increasing the likelihood among those susceptible voters, not the population at large, those susceptible voters, the undecideds, people not anchored to party, the people who don't like either candidate, their susceptibility would explain the fact that in the closing weeks of the election, those undecided voters tipped decisively toward Trump, particularly in the 3 decisive battleground states. So if what you have to look at, now let's step back because your focus is on Russia and what Russia did. What Russia did was harnessed capacities inside our system and we need to put in place barricades to that being done again. First, they harnessed capacities in the platforms. Here's what the platforms have done now that they weren't doing then. They're trying to shut down inauthentic accounts. They're looking for them. They're trying to shut the things down when they find them. Good for the platforms. They're trying to minimize the likelihood that you can purchase ads from as a foreign national. The ads that were purchased in rubles should have been a giveaway, but a whole lot of them were not. But good for them. They now make it much harder to do that through forms of identification to establish that you're actually inside the United States. Now, when a form of non-covert activity occurs, RT and Sputnik are at play here and generating substantial kinds of involvement. When you see that on YouTube, you don't just see RT, which in social media simply means retweet. And for a whole lot of people, it doesn't say Russia because RT isn't Russia Today anymore. Now that's disclaimed as being sponsored by the government. So you're now seeing the platforms trying to think through how they can minimize the access to what they call inauthentic content and ways in which they can frame the content that is there authentically in ways that will at least invite us to scrutinize the source. We've known since at least the 1950s, and we actually have known since Aristotle, but social scientists were confirming it in the 1940s and 1950s, that audiences evaluate message through sources. So to the extent that you trust the source, you're far more likely to trust the message. To the extent that you trust the individual who's trafficking the content to you from the trolls to you because your friend is relaying it, your friend is helping the Russians. To the extent that we can increase the wariness of the population to the likelihood that they are doing that, we decrease the likelihood that their credibility will be harnessed. To the extent that the press granted the credibility of Julian Assange uncritically because they knew he was opposing Hillary Clinton, but they did so because they'd had partnerships with Assange in the past, and his WikiLeaks content had proven reliable. Indeed, in important moments in the past, it had held governments accountable. So I can understand the press disposition to treat this as just another leak. But notice the framing when they call this a leak and when they say it's WikiLeaks as the source. They treat WikiLeaks as a legitimized, credible source as if it's a news source, instead of Julian Assange, who's strategically manipulating the content, and the Russian content. The content is gotten by Russian illegally. And by virtue of calling it a leak, they are obscuring the fact that it is illegally gotten through hacking. Now, if the press had been more conscious of the Russian origins as they wrote their stories, if they'd been more conscious of Julian Assange's role in strategically leaking, they would have been more likely to avoid the additional problem that they inadvertently put into our system. Because at major moments, reputable US journalists took the hacked content out of context. And by that, I mean, if you look at what Assange handed them, and you look at what they then played of it, what you see is what they represented Hillary Clinton to have said was not what she said in the hacked excerpt from the actual memo from Brian Phelan that was being sent into the Democratic High Command in order to say to them, these are things you ought to be concerned about, in particular because they might be taken out of context. And so when the press traffics into the American electoral system through news coverage that Hillary Clinton said she supported open trade and open borders, it is taking hacked content out of context. When it says she said she had a public and private position, and it's that set in news coverage which suggests that, and she was talking to Wall Street bankers about it, it is implying that privately she said such things as, well, I'm not really going to enforce Dodd-Frank, when in fact she said no such thing. And by dropping the context in which she said those things, and the reason they are more susceptible to doing this is they've forgotten Russians are back there. They've forgotten Julian Assange is manipulating them. And so they're starting to treat WikiLeaks as legitimate, and they're so pressured that they're far more likely to take the first framing news has. And when you see the way Assange framed it out to journalists when he dropped it on them, he framed it as public-private, and he framed it as open trade and open borders. And so they do not step back to say, public-private, that was the discussion about Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln, and about how Lincoln was getting us through the Civil War by trying to strategically maneuver through a very complex constitutional context. It was not about what her positions are with Wall Street bankers. And it was not saying, it was not a private confession that, oh, I'm taking private positions here, but publicly I'm going to say something else, but you can trust I'm really going to act on the private positions, which was the casting given it by the press. That is priming a trait, and traits can be set as an agenda. To the extent that you feature, oh, Clinton is duplicitous as you think about vote, as opposed to Clinton is competent as you think about vote, you're more likely to vote against Hillary Clinton if you're one of those susceptible folks in the electorate. Secondly, open trade and open borders. She did not say, I support open trade and open borders. She said sometime in the future in the Western Hemisphere in a sentence that included, and the sentence itself, energy transfer. So was that an affirmation of open trade, open borders support? Hence, that Donald Trump was correct, that she was in fact a hypocrite who was saying one thing in public and another in private, because of course publicly she was saying she did not support open borders. Donald Trump, after that hacked content comes out, says, see, I'm vindicated. And the fact checkers are wrong when they say Hillary Clinton says she doesn't support open borders. See, she said she did it in that private setting. If the press hadn't taken those two things out of context in their media framing, they would not have primed up Clinton duplicity, Clinton lack of trustworthiness, and Clinton says one thing in public, another in private. She drops on those traits across time. She drops on those traits across time, and particularly among debate viewers compared to non-debate viewers in our surveys, that drop predicts a decreased likelihood to vote for her. Now, why does that matter? Because open borders and open trade are, for Donald Trump, digestive campaign statements. It's not just miscellaneous content. It digests his entire attack against Hillary Clinton. She's the one who's going to let the refugees in. She's the one who's going to let all the illegal immigrants in, etc. So if it is a central theme of the Trump campaign and the hacked content legitimized the theme, and in the second debate, the private public statement is quoted as if it is an instance of Clinton duplicity. And if in the third debate, open trade and open borders is quoted by the moderator as if it doesn't have the rest of a sentence, then an audience of over 66 million immediate audience members more remotely were exposed to deceptive framing, inadvertent on the part of fine journalists, that primed contents of evaluation against Hillary Clinton that were problematic to her electorally. Did the Russians accomplish that? Yes, because they got the hacked content, but they did it through Julian Assange and through the press's inability to keep track of the fact that the Russians were back there behind this, that it was illegal, their framing of the content as leaked, occasionally, but not often, as hacked, and not attributed to Assange once you get past this early summer activity. Summary. We, as we're trying to look forward, because that's one of the things that we were going to focus on, need to ask, have the platforms done everything they can? Have we done everything we can to increase the wariness of the electorate to content that they get in social media? Has the press learned the lesson that hacked content wreaks havoc and needs to be independently and carefully verified, and sourcing routinely acknowledged, because that should be a journalistic norm? Journalists are supposed to say, we have not been able to independently confirm. They should have said that every time they used hacked content. Journalists are supposed to source. They should have said Russian hacked, and they should have said illegally gotten. And had they said that, and this is my final point, they would have been more aware of every single time they used it and more likely to have kept it in context. And had they kept it in context, open trade, open borders, and public-private would not have done the damage that I argue in both the first and second edition of cyber war it inflicted on the Clinton presidency and the Clinton candidacy, which denied Clinton the presidency.
Thanks so much. Oh yeah, go for it, Josh.
Go ahead. Yeah, so thanks so much. Thanks so much, Kathleen, and thanks to Renee, and thanks to David for just a spectacularly interesting set of opening statements, and thanks again to Zeev, because the three of them together just presents us such a panoply of the issues that stand here. I'm going to give Zeev the first question, and then I'm going to ask a question myself, and then we'll go to the audience. Zeev.
Yeah, so my first question, Kathleen, is actually a direct follow-up to your final point. And this is sort of a question about how we talk about electoral interference, right? So how can we sort of balance the need to inform the public about a foreign attempt to undermine our democratic processes on the one hand, without having the very communication of that information undermine our democratic processes? So like, what can scholars, and in particular the media, do to strike this balance as we go into the 2020 election?
Well, this is why that kind of interference is a win-win for anybody who engages in it, because there is a dilemma created by virtue of your success in doing it. Indeed, even the threat that you may be able to be successful creates the problem which the Obama administration faced and which David treats. How is it supposed to deal with this without, in the process, creating perceptions of a delegitimized election? And it raises a question I have for the Russian scholars on the panel, which is it possible that the Russians planted evidence that they were in the election infrastructure in order to be found, because by virtue of being found, they increased the likelihood that they created that dilemma, and the likelihood that after the election, the fact that they were there would be, as a result, part of the dialogue, could be used in the future to argue that any election is illegitimate because our systems were so vulnerable that they got in the last time.
So actually, that leads very nicely into the point that I wanted to ask. So Tim Fry has written in the Q&A about the following, which sort of says, Nate Silver, Thomas Rid, John Sides, and others argue that it is very unlikely that Russian social media efforts had any impacts on voters or public opinion. They note that Russian social media efforts were such a tiny fraction of all social media efforts related to the election in 2016, et cetera, and then a lot of the things that Kathleen talked about, that these efforts were pretty clumsy and that much of the disinformation was shared among hardcore partisans, particularly on the extreme right, who were already consuming lots of fake news from other sources. What do you think about these arguments? And what I want to add to that as well is I want to add a kind of maybe perspective view of that question. So there's this question which Kathleen has addressed a bit about whether whether this really, the social media post had much of an impact. And I will say, as a quick shout out, we're actually working on something in our lab where we have panel data over time, and we're looking at people's exposure to tweets on this. So I'm hoping we'll be able to have something to say on that going forward shortly. But on top of this question of was there an impact, and then building off of Zeev's question and Kathleen's answer a minute ago, going into 2020, when we look at the sort of social media activity that we saw in 2016, are we more concerned about the impacts that this would have? And like Renee, you said, look, this actually led to people coming out onto the streets eventually. Or are we more concerned about the sort of paranoia about foreign electoral interference on social media, creating a climate whereby then claims that there are foreign electoral interferences that are manipulating mail-in ballots, and that it just plays into this sort of larger narrative into that the elections are somehow not secure in 2020, which is, of course, is enhanced by COVID. It's enhanced by the growth of mail-in ballots. So my question is, are we more worried? So I'd love to hear answers to Tim's question, which is like, what do you think about this? But the second part of it is looking forward to 2020. Are we more worried about hysteria around Russian interference in the election, or are we more worried about Russian interference in the election? And Renee and David, I'd love to give you a chance, and Kathleen, if you want to jump in on that as well. Renee or David, do either of you want to go first?
Sure.
Renee, thanks.
So one of the things, it's funny, I actually pulled the slides because I felt like I was going to go on for way too long. The Internet Research Agency socialized Julian Assange for about 2 weeks prior to the dump on the 6th. So there were a lot of these memes coming out talking about what a good Nobel freedom fighter Julian Assange was. So this is one of the areas where when I say like we don't have evidence of coordination in any kind of official sense of the word, we do see these like anomalous things which they spontaneously decided to talk about how great Assange was. The question of the making known that they had hacked the voting infrastructure, this is something that we're also very interested in. It seemed right up until the absolute last second, based on their social media communications targeting the right in particular, they really did believe that Trump was going to lose. And they really did they were laying the groundwork for arguing that the election was illegitimate. In my report for the Senate, you can read, we did a very long, narrative overview of the week leading into the election. This is what the Twitter accounts were saying. This is what the Facebook accounts were saying. Here's how they seemed to see their own work. And so there was a sense that they were going to attempt to delegitimize the election. And by having this presence, that of course is a phenomenal piece of additional kind of, bolstering. We were in your systems, we could have changed the votes, right? Or somebody could have. And so that is a thing that people are concerned about this time around in particular. I would say, though, to answer the broader question, domestic actors are as capable of using this ecosystem as foreign actors are. And because they have what we call blue check cred, there is something to be said for the kind of immediate heuristic, that the belief that if someone with a blue check account is saying it, it is somehow legitimate. We saw this in very small scale. You may recall the Iowa caucus results were delayed. And instead of having a calm, process by which we all sat back and waited for the Iowa caucus results to be dealt with, we had the blue check disinformation pointing to a variety of nefarious actors in the DNC and otherwise who were behind this vast conspiracy to deny Bernie Sanders his win on caucus night, right? And so that collection of highly partisan accounts was able to kind of spin up this concept that Robbie Mook was behind it. There were a whole range of different theories. You don't need foreign actors to do that, but where they can come in should they want to is in the amplification process. And that's the part that we think is actually much more of a vulnerability. It's easy to trace narratives, like we're actually quite good at that now. It's easy to understand where something originated. It's very hard to have the full picture of how it was disseminated and how it was made to reach vast numbers of people as quickly as we'd like at this point. And so that's the interesting piece, which is the narrative is out there, the damage is done almost instantaneously because everyone is paying attention. And so if you do, manage to, if you are a foreign agent who wants to amplify a conspiracy theory, you can really just find your conspiracy theory from a blue check influencer at this point and just amp it up. And so that's the unfortunate kind of communication dynamic that we have today. And I think that's much more of a legitimate threat vector than, the creation of vast tribes of trolls the way that we saw in 2016.
David?
Yeah, so, and I think I agree with all of that. I think dialing back a little bit to the point about our infrastructure and how that interplays with sort of Russia's broader strategy here across social media. For my book, I did interview about 26 former advisors to President Obama to really try to get at the heart of what their experience was like in responding to this operation. And I think what Kathleen said is spot on, which is that Russia, I would guess, wanted America to know was inside our systems. Amy Pope, who was the Deputy Homeland Security Advisor in 2016, told me that she concluded in the summer of 2016, Russia wanted us to know we're vulnerable. They were sending us a message, which is that our systems are exposed. So much so that on election day itself, as I get into, the White House and DHS were running secret crisis teams bracing for a Russian cyber attack against our infrastructure. John Brennan and Jim Clapper told me that Russia had the ability to manipulate voter data and even the vote tallies of US citizens. And they also told me, which is what Renee was talking about, that Russia and Putin thought Trump was going to lose, and that they had contingency plans that were in motion to undermine Hillary Clinton's victory, to undermine her presidency, the legitimacy of her win, in order to sow doubt about the sanctity of our voting processes and the credibility of her presidency. And so as we look toward the future, I think that should provide some sort of humility and also a clear-eyed assessment of the threat we're facing, which is this is not about Donald Trump. He is a means to an end, which is to degrade and corrupt American democracy, which sounds sort of vague, but it's very real because the process of succession, our elections, are the heart of our society. It's about future, it's about progress, it's about order. And from Russia's perspective, if you can, whether it's through social media, through document dumps, by manipulating voter data and select polling places or precincts or select states, by doing those things, you can make people believe your election wasn't actually fair, it wasn't actually secure and legitimate. And so as we look toward the future and think about what could happen, I think what Kathleen said makes a lot of sense, which is that the 2016 election was weirdly close. So there were opportunities to try to change the outcome that might have not been, and people were undecided, and there were opportunities there to influence in that way. I would say just as that perhaps was our vulnerability 4 years ago, our vulnerability today is how much doubt there is about this election even being fair and happening at all because of the president saying it'll be rigged, because of the coronavirus, because people don't even know how they're going to vote. There's already, in terms of pre-existing vulnerabilities, our country is on edge with respect to the sanctity and security of this election. So therefore, when we talk about all these different ideas, whether social media documents or systems, you can really execute upon any of those in a really aggressive way to make people believe that the election is a farce. And that is the Russian objective. It is to corrupt and tear down democracies, both to show their own people democracy doesn't work and to transform the American system into a corrupted version of itself. So as I look toward the future, that's what I'm bracing for Russia to try to do. I think that could take many different forms, but that was what Obama's Russia advisors and intelligence chiefs believed was the plan for the day after Hillary Clinton won, to reveal that voter data had been altered, to spread disinformation online that polling places were corrupted in her favor, in order to make people question whether the president was actually the president. And we are so much more vulnerable to that kind of an attack now than I think we've been in the modern history of this country.
Yeah, let me there's controversy about the title of my book, Cyber War, because some have argued that the troll activity wasn't cyber war, the hacking activity wasn't cyber war. I believe you can make a very strong case that at the point at which you touch the electoral infrastructure, you have now breached national sovereignty. And if you are it's ever established that you've actually manipulated it, that even in more traditional terms, that breach of national sovereignty falls into a reasonable definition of what constitutes cyber war. But the concept of cyber and how you retaliate when you retaliate is a really important and interesting and vexatious question. I mean, we know now because President Trump confirmed it a few weeks ago that we did hack back in 2018. What happens when someone does something to us? How do we respond? How do we get both sides to step down? Should there be some kind of an international agreement in which we all basically agreed in nuclear non-proliferation? We all step down. And David makes the important point, and Putin makes it as well, that the US has done these kinds of things for long periods of time. Why Putin surmises, should anybody be surprised that somebody else might, hypothetically, that might not be him, of course, might engage in the same activities. One other quick point, one of the gifts of being able to take a book into second edition is you're able to engage the important scholars who take issue with the argument in your book. And there is a new chapter in the book that point by point takes on the alternative claims and the alternative evidence that emerged after the first edition was read. And one of the things that is important as we ask the question, did the effect actually matter, is that it features the ways in which scholars are and are not able to draw inferences that help us answer that question with evidence. It's the absence of certain kinds of research-based evidence that makes it very difficult for us to tighten down the inference. I think we're going to have a lot better scholarship out of this election than last because we're a lot more vigilant looking at the patterns of possible manipulation, and we're better instrumented as a result to see those electoral effects.
Can I add one quick thing to that also, Josh, really quickly? If you look at the question of, as folks have raised, this is a small percentage of the content on social media. That's absolutely true. And if you're using as your denominator the sum total of all posts on social media, that's absolutely 100% accurate. But because of the way social media infrastructure is designed, as we've seen now with coronavirus in particular, what matters is what information makes it into particular activist clusters that in turn serve as vectors and have ties into other activist clusters. And this is a thing that we've tried to do at Stanford in particular recently. Some of the posts, you can look at our research on plandemic, for example, where was plandemic pushed into the media, awareness bubble of the entirety of the American population? No. Did it make it into QAnon, anti-vax, and certain communities that were highly activist that then in turn propelled it along? Yes. And that's where I think our understanding of computational propaganda has to take into account prevalence of the kind of micro-targeted populations, and then the extent to which those populations serve as transmission vectors into other communities and how that information hops. And that's not, that's not topically distinct. That's a structural function at this point that we have to get better at understanding. And so when we think about impact, again, you can very plausibly make the argument that plandemic itself was a very, very tiny thing, but it dominated the ecosystem and then got media coverage and then hit mass awareness. And that's the kind of process that we see time and time again now.
We also have ample historical evidence that media effects can be created when content that was micro-targeted comes into national media. The Swiftboat Veterans for Truth, so-called effect produced by advertising in August 2004 was not produced by the advertising itself directly airing to its audiences. It was produced through exposure through news nationally to susceptible audiences. So the question always is, where is the audience susceptible to persuasion and what are the means that get it there? And relaying out of a network is one, but finding means of mass exposure that are not carefully framed and as a result increase cognitive accessibility to problematic arguments can be another. That's what happened in 2004. We know that because we were properly instrumented and we were in the field every day with a rolling cross-sectional analysis so we could show the effects of the ads as opposed to the effects of the news.
Yeah, and totally. And I would say one thing too on the question of impact. I mean, I think a lot of this also just comes down to common sense, which is that skeptics, I think, love to say, well, if you can't prove that X numbers of minds were changed, therefore none of this matters. And that's such a bad faith and a logical argument, because just dictated by common sense, does it matter that a foreign intelligence service is stealing and releasing anonymously tens of thousands of sensitive documents designed to hurt a presidential campaign? Of course that matters. Does it matter that tens of millions of people's minds are being reached with foreign propaganda without realizing it? Of course. Does it matter that a foreign intelligence service is scanning and penetrating the election systems of our country systematically? Of course that matters. That's why Russia's doing this to countries all over the world. That's why the IRA, as we've seen through communications that were released, believes that they changed the outcome of the election. Whether that's true or not, they believe it. So this question of impact, I found, can be such a great sort of impediment to progress, because it can be used to try to say, well, therefore all of this is bogus and none of this matters. And I think that the cases that are being made by Renee and Kathleen, to me, just make that a completely nonsensical position. And the question here is, how do we defend our electoral processes? Not can we prove how much an advertisement matters, because I think that that's something that no political campaign can even do domestically. How many minds am I changing through this ad campaign? That's never been something that's precisely answerable, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact.
Yeah, the other question is, are we looking for impact in all the right places? So if Russian disinformation influenced Comey's decision to, in effect, make public the reopened WAGNER investigation in late October, then that fact of making public, which demonstrably changed the press agenda and coincides with a substantial drop for Hillary Clinton in favorability and vote preference, then that of itself needs to be a point that we look at as a potential source of impact. The problem being, many of these things happen through a chain to get to the impact. So the trolls have an impact because of what people do as a result of that might influence other people. The hacking influences through Julian Assange, a journalist, that changes the agenda, that may reprioritize. It's very difficult for people to see impact that is downstream. Distal effects are always more difficult to get people to understand, even though we know that they exist. And so first, looking for impact in all the possible places, and then increasing our understanding of the patterns through which impact exerts its influence becomes another item for scholarly scrutiny.
Yeah, these are all excellent points. David, I want to just push back just a little bit, or maybe put a little clarification on it, which is that I think it's very easy in this discussion to conflate multiple things. Like, and I'm going to crib a little bit from Renee, from talking with Renee in the past, but on the one hand, there is a whole question of national security, right? Like, and is this a threat to national security to have a foreign government that's trying to do these types of things, which is one pillar of questions. Then there's the pillar of questions I think Kathleen's asking about, which is, you know, can you change the narrative by actions that are going, and what's the impact of suddenly having the press have all this, have all of these different, you know, have all this impact on people. Then there's the third question, which is the question that I think the narrower question, which is, what was the impact of these social media posts by these foreign influence campaigns? And I think, Renee, the point that you bring up, it's a great point, and I think it's one that we've advanced, you know, we have advanced our thinking on this in the last couple of years, beyond this just question of like, what's the magnitude to where is it directed and what happens. The one thing I would just sort of push back on a little bit is that I think with questions like pandemic and public health, right, we can then say, if you have things that are, you know, undermining people's public health, and that gets into even small portions of the population, that can have a very damaging impact on it. Tim's Fry question, which launched this discussion, you know, way back 25 minutes ago here, was that, well, if in the question is about, you know, shifting votes, and this information is only getting into the hands of people who are highly partisan and are highly motivated to vote in one way or another, then what is this sort of downstream effect of it? And I just kind of keep coming back to, and this conflates two areas of research, right, like that I'm heavily involved in. One is the foreign influence campaigns, but the other is, you know, that we've talked, I want to use the right term, Kathleen, imposter news, right? Organizations, yeah, thanks, that we're producing, that we're pretending to be newspapers, that we're producing things that were actually false and not real news. Again, with both of these things, I think in the aftermath of 2016, there became this widespread belief that this was just prevalence, that everybody's social media feed was filled with IRA trolls, and people were reading tons and tons of this imposter news. And one of the things that the scholarly academic literature has done, including some of our work at CSMAP, has been to sort of try to reset those narratives. And I do feel like that is an important thing for scholars to be doing. And I think it's important that we are able to do that in a way whereby it's not calling into question the national security implications of foreign influence. It's not calling into question Kathleen's point about what did the leak of the DIRESTA, but it is trying a realistic reset. And that was sort of why I was pushing you guys in the beginning about like this hysteria question around it, because especially with the false information, we worry about if you're constantly reminding people, oh, the news you see may come from a foreign source, the news you see may be false or misleading, does that eventually make them much more susceptible to when leaders say any news that attacks me is false, is fake news, right? Does it make them more susceptible to that? Anyway, so this has been great. I want to pass over to Alex because there are other questions in the Q&A on other topics, and I want to make sure that we get to them in our last 20 minutes here, because I feel we could keep talking about this topic for the rest of the time and never get to any of them. So Alex?
Yeah, I want to go back into the realm of geopolitics and combine some different questions that we've gotten from our audience members. And so, David, I think this will go to you. And this is from both Kevin Platt and Kimberly Martin, who are asking about U.S. involvement in the 1996 Yeltsin election. Is this something that you cover in the book? Is this something that you've done research on? Of course, this is a popular comeback to accusations of 2016 Russian interference in the U.S. election. The comeback is almost, well, what about the U.S. and the West clearly supporting Yeltsin in 1996? And then if I could bundle that, David, with a question for Bill Wolforth, who's joining us also, who asks, in the book, you suggest the U.S. foster a global norm or law starting with community democracies and outlawing electoral interference. And he's wondering whether you've gotten any feedback from this from relevant current and former U.S. officials. And I would only add to that, this has been one of the topics in some of these U.S.-Russian working groups, whether there's any possibility of creating new norms or red lines about mutual interference. And of course, it gets to the question of what each side considers to be interference. So I know it's a lot for you to answer, but maybe if you could deal with the 1996 part and then the sort of perspective going forward part.
And before you answer, just to add before you start to answer, just to add a little bit more, because we got a question from the YouTube channel that is right on topic of this, which is Rachel. Rachel Wellhausen said, "Read the excellent presentation on the history of both sides' interference. Might a hypocrisy narrative be politically impactful in third countries, undermining support for the U.S. position?" So I just think that kind of fits in that question as well. All right. Take it away.
Okay, so I'll hit those. So on 96, I actually this is more accessible than the book. I just published an article about this in the Washington Post for any listeners who want to sort of read much more briefly what happened there. And I would say, as for American interference in 96, that's an apples and orange comparison. I think that if people want to say America's done this, you can point to CIA interference in countries like Italy or Chile. And I do think there are still differences there. I don't even think that's equivalent, but that's a separate argument. But in 96, that was overt. That wasn't covert. I interviewed Bill Clinton, many of his cabinet officials about their engagement with the election, how they thought about it. Many of these documents have been declassified. And the story of the 96 election, I actually believe, is not U.S. interference in it. It's Boris Yeltsin's solicitation of it. Because what comes out when you go through the hundreds of pages of declassified calls between Yeltsin and Clinton, it's actually quite fun to read because it's almost like a movie. Yeltsin, every single time they speak, begs Bill Clinton to help him win the election, says, you have to do this for me, do that for me, give me this, give me that. So it's to the point where he asked for a multi-billion-dollar loan to help his campaign because he thought he was going to lose. And Bill Clinton, at every step, says, oh, maybe I'll try, but I can't do this, and walks a very fine line and ends up definitely doing some things to try to help Yeltsin overtly, making his policy preferences known, also helping him get a loan from the IMF. But there was no, based on all available evidence, CIA covert action program to help get Boris Yeltsin elected. There's no evidence of that. So I would say that as for the 96 election, from Putin's perspective, it shows the dangers of actual democracy because it shows how it can make Russia's leaders reliant on the West, Boris Yeltsin reliant on other leaders to remain in power. That, to me, is the legacy of the 96 election, not America's, flipping it. I think there was just domestic corruption and voter fraud within Russia instigated by Yeltsin and his collaborators. But that to me is the story of 96. And I would encourage you to look at the WAPO article in terms of that dialogue between Clinton and Yeltsin, because it's very pertinent to the dialogues that we've seen between Trump and Putin as to how a current incumbent can lean on other leaders to help them remain in power and how those asks can evolve over time. As to the future, I argue in my conclusion that we have to renew our democracy at home to defend against these operations, and I map out how to do that, but I also argue that we need to renew our leadership abroad. We need to bring together a coalition of democracies to deter and punish countries who engage in this type of covert electoral interference operation. And in order to do that, I believe the CIA must ban covert electoral interference. The next president should ban this practice because Americans might not be that aware of the fact that this is a storied part of our history, but the world is. When I went to many different countries interviewing folks about this subject, they all said, well, the CIA does this, the CIA has done this, the CIA is doing this. And until we say proactively, we will not do this, and if we actually do continue to do this, and then we're caught, it undermines our position. It shows the world that we're not serious about seeking to deter this type of behavior. It normalizes what Russia's doing, and it plays into Russia's hands in seeking to undermine and degrade the notion that democracy can actually be an independent exercise. So in terms of hypocrisy, I do think if America interfered covertly in an election right now while we're preaching, as we should be, that we stand for free and fair elections, and also as we ourselves are so vulnerable and we're condemning Russia, that would be extremely hypocritical and a mistake. But this is not a settled debate. In my book, I also show that folks like Leon Panetta, Harry Reid, and other influential voices believe the CIA should be back in the game, full force, to meet Russia toe-to-toe in elections all over the world. So this might not be a debate that we see because this is about covert action. It's not about public policy in the traditional sense, but it is not a settled question. There is disagreement about whether the CIA should be interfering covertly in elections. And my argument is that we should not be. And there were many folks I interviewed who agreed with me. There were some who did not. And that's just a fact of where we are as a country, because we have yet to come up with any sort of coherent policy response to the Russian threat, both to our own elections and to the elections of our allies around the world.
That's great, David. Thank you so much. I'd like to also go now to Kathleen and to Renee with a question from first Greg McGee, who says, what do you recommend the communication strategy to the larger populace be? How can we most clearly and concisely convey the threat and the divisive tactics used? And then Eva Nikitovich asks, how much of today's conflict surrounding race and police, both on social media and in person through protest, do you think is being instigated by the three Russian actors mentioned? So I'll leave it to you to balance of your time, how much of these you want to address. But Kathleen, do you want to start off with you? Because your comments on how we should frame and how we should treat this also brings up the question of in terms of sort of policy prescriptions, what is the best communication strategy for understanding this?
Let me focus very narrowly. We need to make sure that the U.S. press has the vocabulary to talk about leaking and hacking, illegality, legality, and standards by which it communicates in clear language what the sourcing is, whether it's legal or illegal, and whether or not they have authenticated and are casting this as trustworthy or not. So part of the vocabulary through which we communicate to the public is a press vocabulary. And if the press has that language in place, it's more likely to see through that language. See through, that is, use it as a lens on an event. And as a result, be conscious of it as it communicates. I mean, part of the dilemma for the press is if you actually had to say every time you used hacked content, Russian gotten, Julian Assange trafficked, illegal, et cetera, you would have prose that no one would be able to read. So journalists are much better than academics at this. Find a vocabulary to talk about this, because we know hacking and leaking are going to occur whether through foreign nationals or not. And much legitimate content comes into the body politic as a result of leaked content. So the question is, what are you going to say to us when that happens in order to mark it for us so that we also are able to make use of legitimate content that is gotten through those kinds of channels, that is gotten legally under most circumstances by the press, not necessarily legally by the person who got it, and how the public can create an interpretive frame for it. And then secondly, a larger question, the platforms need to find a way to talk to us. So the platforms now take down an account and call it an inauthentic account. I defy you to find a person on the street who can define what an inauthentic account is. So these organizational structures that talk to us about it have to find a vocabulary that we can learn so we understand what they are saying when they tell us that something has happened.
Thanks so much, Renee.
Yeah, sure. Well, inauthentic actually came about in part because of the phrase, we don't want to be the arbiters of truth. And so the reason inauthenticity was used is because it doesn't speak to the truth or untruth of the content itself, but rather to the distribution patterns, the legitimacy, are the people involved real, and then the some kind of metadata around the domains and things. So that's where that that term came from back in early 2018 when we were trying to think about what we could say about these things. I would say, just to add to Kathleen's point, journalists in particular serve a very significant role here. Communicating about attribution and impact as clearly as possible is key. I think that we need to get better just as a country on everything. I think pandemic has shown us this too. Communicating in terms of like degrees of confidence. How confident are we in an assessment that the media is putting out? It doesn't even matter what the topic is at this point, because things change so quickly. And when something is revealed to have been wrong or new information comes out, and then there has to be an update to the story, if you have made it sound like this is the be all and end all of attribution or whatever else, that kind of erodes confidence in further communications down the line. So I think that's one of the ways that we just have to change the ways in which we communicate about, in the information environment of today, period, because everyone is expecting new information to come out instantaneously. And that's that means that a lot of kind of fog happens with many of our very significant conversations, and it will happen on election night as well. There was another part to the question which was related to, I think, the race, the Floyd protests and so on and so forth, right? Yes. So on that front, that's been really interesting. So one of the things that we do at SIO is we try to look at emerging narratives. And whenever there's a significant protest or something, understanding the dynamics in the hashtags, the dynamics in the Facebook shares, what's getting attention, how do things reach people's degrees of attention. I alluded to it a little bit in terms of like, it's easy to amplify a real source of tension. There's a lot of people who are looking for Russian bots. I think that we're at a point, interestingly, with a lot of these protest movements where you can actually see, you just see Russia state media doing it. So you see Redfish, for example, amplifying certain facets of protest movements. You see Redfish and RT taking, they're owned by the same, they're both, Redfish is a subsidiary of RT. You see literally both sides of Russian state propaganda running slightly different narratives, one leaning heavily into the left kind of millennial culture with videos, the other leaning into stories about those looters tearing down statues, right? And so you actually can just see it happening in the broadcast media. It doesn't even have to be trolling at this point. It's just so much a part of the of our information environment. So nobody has found evidence of duplicitous Internet Research Agency style attribution on that activity, though that amplification of perspectives is happening. One thing I would say, though, interestingly, one thing we did find was actually spammers in Pakistan who manipulated Facebook Live to push out video of old kind of police, arrest videos and things that were stripped of context that were pushed out as if they were happening live. And because they were coming through the Facebook Live stream, for anybody who was there on Facebook Live looking at a hashtag, Justice for Floyd was one of the big ones, you would see these old videos just being pushed out by these economically motivated spammers who had realized that by using certain types of gaming software, they could do that. And so there's such an innovative degree of tactics at this point. It's really much more a function of anyone can do this, and everyone is, and the motivations are not even to interfere in the protest movement at that point. It was just some guys who wanted more followers for their page. So when we talk about the challenges of the communication architecture, I think that really is much more of the core problem as opposed to which adversary is doing it at this point.
I wanted to jump in quickly to sort of echo Kathleen's point. This idea of sort of coordinated inauthentic behavior is probably the most apt definition I've heard of what a political campaign in the United States is. And so I think it's really important for us to come up with sort of meaningful and precise language to describe these red lines between types of behavior. And I think too frequently, sort of academics tend to lean towards more technical jargon. And we know that the actual social media platforms will lean too heavily towards sort of corporate legalese. And so I think the media can really fill in this gap and find what that sort of right language is.
And let me bridge the two ideas. And Josh referred to this. I'm bothered when academics use the concept fake news, except to refer to accounts that are appropriating the identity of a legitimate news site as if it is their own, and trafficking in that image structure. Because news can't be fake. If it is news, it corrects itself when it is called out because something is they've gotten something wrong. And I think most of the time what we're actually talking about is not anything that is appropriation of a news site, although Josh is in his scholarship, but rather we're talking about viral deception. We're concerned about its virality. The noun is deception. The noun is not news. When you say fake news, you're delegitimizing news because you're suggesting it can be fake. We need to protect journalism and its integrity. I prefer viral deception because virality is what we're worried about. Deception is the noun that is our object of inquiry. And I prefer VD as the acronym because I want to analogize it to venereal disease. You don't want to catch it. You don't want to spread it. If you see it, you want to quarantine it.
All right. Well, I think that's probably a good note. We've already on which to end. We've already, taken a lot of people, and I want to thank all of our viewers for sticking with us. This has been just we're now past an hour and a half, going on an hour and 45 minutes, but the conversation has been too fascinating to try to end earlier. I want to thank once again all of our panelists for joining us. I mean, I've been living and breathing this stuff for the last 3 years, and yet getting these three people together, I've learned a ton of things today, and it's been really wonderful to be able to get all of you in one place here. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with all of you, which I know we will. I'm going to pass it over to Alex to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think, one of the things that we try and do in this series along with NYU is to really try and push the frontiers of this idea of what area studies is and what Russian area studies is in sort of new directions. And to me, it's interdisciplinary, it's cross-professional, and it's reflexive, right? Good area studies tells us as much about the assumptions about our own houses and our own intellectual context and frames as it does the region that we're studying. And I just think this is such a remarkable and fruitful area to keep exploring. And I'm so grateful to our three speakers, and especially to you, Zeev, for putting this together. I think it's a remarkably fruitful and timing dialogue. And I want to thank everyone for being with us over the summer. I know COVID has challenged all of us and that you're all zoomed out, but it's been terrific to have you here as a community. And of course, I want to thank Josh and all the teams at NYU and Columbia that have made this series work, to Carly, to Sasha, to Alex. We just can't do it without you. So wishing everyone an excellent August. And please do come back to us in September. We'll have more debates, more panels, more content. And thanks again, everyone. Take some time off, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again in September. Thanks.
And thanks to Carnegie for funding these these workshops.
Thanks to Carnegie, absolutely, yeah. Take care.